We've got a few days before Canada and USA face off again in the Four Nations Face Off Final. So let's chat about how the Jets prospects are doing and take a look at some major expectations for a Winnipeg playoff run.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day, every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support. Tonight's episode, as we are waiting for the Four Nations face-off to kick off, and then, or the final at least, and then consequently not long after that, the resumption of the NHL season. You know, there's a lot of stuff happening for Jets prospects and things behind the scenes. And so I wanted to spend some time catching up with the Jets kiddos, see how they're doing, and talk about maybe some players who might be eligible to be moved at the trade deadline because, well, unfortunately, to get, you're going to have to give. And I think that's very true for Winnipeg. Before we dive into all of that, though, did want to let you know that today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can bet $100 or get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Stay tuned to hear more about why FanDuel is your best betting choice, especially for both the NBA and the NHL. Now, like I said, let's check in on the kids. For the Jets this year, there have been some very interesting standouts. Some players that I don't think anyone was necessarily expecting to really take off. Maybe a couple of guys who have been really impressive, just generally speaking, and are continuing a growing trend. And some guys who have sort of fallen off the pace a bit. Now, the biggest riser in Winnipeg's system is definitely Kieron Walton, one of our more recent arrivals. Walton is like 6'6", a massive winger who also occasionally plays at center. For Sudbury this year, he has been basically unstoppable. He is 7th in OHL scoring. He has been on an unholy tear. He is one of our highest points per game players at about 1.5 points per game, 80 points and 53 so far for the Wolves. And it won't be long before he'll be making his pro transition over the next couple of years. With him, I do feel some sense of urgency to start thinking about getting him signed here pretty soon. You know, obviously he's not necessarily eligible to depart Sudbury just yet, but I think you really want to start having those overtures and laying the groundwork because by the time he is eligible to leave, you want to have him under contract. You want to get him into your system. And I think at this point, you know, because he's so physically mature and developed, you probably want to see if he can maybe start to hang around some of the pro-level players. I mean, that's a really big deal for him. I think, you know, making sure that he doesn't go to college, which sounds really bad in some ways, but, you know, out of context, right? In context, you want him to enter the Jets pro system. Maybe having him be integrated sooner, get him used to the pro rigors could be really helpful because, like, with him being 6'6" and stuff, I think you want to have a little more direct control over his development. College hasn't always been as helpful for the Jets. It's not been the worst for everyone, but there are some players who probably could have been to the Jets a little bit more clearly had he actually, had they actually come to the Jets first and entered their, pro system. So really impressive year. I'm expecting him to continue to just be really fantastic. And I think he's a guy that you really should get excited about. More as a winger than a center. That's what I've heard. I think that's going to be, his most likely position, but should be a fun one. A guy who has been definitely labeled as Winnipeg's future 2C and a guy who I think might actually challenge for a spot next year. I don't think he'll necessarily earn it, but I think he'll fight for it. It's Brayden Yager. Yager, since coming over to the Jets system out of Pittsburgh, has been fantastic. He was recently traded to Lethbridge, 37 points in 21 games. His scoring rates have taken flight. He just continues to dominate, and he played such a mature game in camp that I'm really impressed and think that his pro-level play is going to be something to keep an eye on. Of the Jets center prospects, I feel like he might be one of the most coveted, and it makes me wonder if the Jets go for a really big termed player, somebody who, fits the Jets for the next 2 to 3 years. I think Yager could be a player that gets moved in that deal. I think he's one of the least preferable prospects to move, but I think the Jets would probably be most willing to move a guy of that caliber or of a Brad Lambert caliber. But in terms of Lambert himself, Brad's been pretty decent. This year, I think for Manitoba has just been all over the place. In 36 games, he's at like 20 points. He still sits in the upper echelons of the Moose scoring, top three, top four. And so I don't want to sit there and say, that he's been really disappointing, because I feel like when your really experienced AHL veterans are actually scoring at a lower pace than he is, it might just be that the team itself is really bad offensively and Lambert's kind of being held back by that team. That's the general impression I get. I think that, the Moose scoring has been just absolutely atrocious this year. Your top scorer is Parker Ford, and he's at 41 games and only just about a half a point per game. That's very off the pace for what you'd usually see from him. And Manitoba's offense is it's grim. So I would not read too much into what's happening with Lambert's season so far. I think Brad is better than what we're seeing, and I'm not too worried about it. But other players that I think have really stepped up. Kevin, he continues to be pretty productive. Again, his scoring pace has slowed a bit. Just 60 points in 49 games, but I think he'll be fine. He's got a great shot, great personality. I think he'll be a wonderful middle six kind of player for the Jets, and a real kind of future captainy sort for Winnipeg's eventual core. Colby Barlow has also started to pick it up, finally over a point per game with Oshawa. It's been a slow climb for him, 52 points in 51 games. I think he's probably one of the most eligible prospects to be involved in a trade. I think that there's a lot to like about his shot. I think the rest of his game is where I've still had questions about the higher level technical ability and how much it translates to the NHL. But because of that shot, I think he will have a pro career. I just don't know what level it's going to be at. And I think for teams that are maybe looking for some tertiary scoring ability, he might be of interest. Again, I think his star has kind of declined since the Jets drafted him, but I could see a team being interested in him. Another guy that it is probably worth keeping an eye on, and the last guy that we'll talk about here briefly, is Elias Salomonsson. Salmon Boy has kind of slowed slightly in scoring pace for the Moose. Only 15 points in 26 games, and I'm jokingly saying only. He has more points than most of that roster, and he plays a pretty prime position. I think he is one of the few prospects in Winnipeg's pool that's basically untouchable. It would have to require a Sidney Crosby level sort of package for him to be involved in a move, because Salomonsson, is a big right-sided guy. Not small, but, not like massive. He's very mobile. He skates well. And the offensive side of his game has really blossomed to the point where, I wouldn't be shocked if in a couple of years we see him on the top pairing. I think he's got that potential. He is already lighting it up with the Moose in just his first year in North America. He's a young player. I think that he is primed for a very bright future. As he continues to get his pro level game accustomed to this side of the pond and continues developing his defensive awareness, his decision making and timing, I think all of that is going to make him a really, really good player. And again, I think of the many Jets prospects that are impressing this year, he might be at or near the top. So I actually have him in some ways as Winnipeg's number one overall prospect. Again, the top is pretty close with a lot of really good performers, but I think given his age, the position that he plays, and his already rapid acclimation to the AHL, I just have to go with him. I think he is our number one prospect. I think it'll take an absolute haul to move him out of there, and I cannot wait to see what he does for the Jets here, maybe as soon as next year. I don't think it's likely to happen. I think he's got another 2 years with the Moose at least. But the Jets, I think, really internally rate him highly, so maybe he kind of comes in here sooner than expected. So keep an eye on that. But he is a really impressive prospect, very excited about him, and I can't wait to see what he does in camp next year. Now, amidst all of this, the Jets are trying to figure out what they need for the playoffs, and I want to talk about what I expect from them and some things I'm kind of keeping an eye out from the coaching staff, right? This is going to be one of the biggest tests of what Arniel is really capable of, because so far this year, the Jets' power play and the goaltending have been enough to basically dominate the regular season. But we all know that the Jets don't really struggle with regular seasons that often. It's what happens in the playoffs that becomes your biggest question. I want to chat about that in just a little bit, but before we go any further, did want to let you know about our friends and partners at SelectQuote. In sports, having a winning strategy is everything. It's how the best teams make it to the Super Bowl, the World Series, the Olympics, the Four Nations face-off. The same goes for life. Having a strategy like life insurance from SelectQuote can protect your financial legacy and keep your family's future secure. SelectQuote makes it easy to find the perfect life insurance policy. As one of America's leading insurance brokers with nearly 40 years of experience, they've helped over 2 million customers find $700 billion in coverage since 1985. What sets SelectQuote apart is their personal touch. Unlike other brokers that offer one-size-fits-all policies, their licensed agents tailor coverage to fit your unique needs. If you're in good health, you might even qualify for same-day coverage of up to $5 million. No medical exam required. It's more affordable than you'd think, too. You can get up to $1 million in coverage for as little as $20 a month. Get the right life insurance for you for less at selectquote.com/LockedOnNHL. Go to selectquote.com/LockedOnNHL today to get started. That's selectquote.com/LockedOnNHL. SelectQuote. They shop, you save. Hey friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we are chatting a little bit about some playoff expectations for Winnipeg. The Jets are in a really interesting stage here, and this is one of the more unusual seasons that I've seen from Winnipeg, in part because I think that, people talk about them as being the best team in the league, and in a lot of ways, I think that's true. There are a couple of key areas where I don't think that's the case, and I don't know if those areas are enough to be a problem in the playoffs, because traditionally they have been. But those problem areas are not as bad as they were in previous seasons. And because the rest of the league is kind of like mediocre this year, the more I've thought about it, the more I just wonder how big of a problem are some of these issues, say, with your 5v5 creation, right? And that's kind of where I've been wondering about what happens with Scott Arniel in the playoffs. We've seen him in the regular season so far, and I think that there are some key things that he's done really well. For the first thing, I think his depth lines have generally controlled play at a great level. Defensively, resolute. Offensively, they've used relatively fast transition offense and forechecking to create pressure. And sure, it may not always lead to a lot of scoring, but that's where I think a big trade deadline can maybe bring in a little more offensive support. I think the biggest thing is just making sure they play the right way. And so far, in terms of like lines 2, 3, and 4, generally speaking, you're getting pretty great results, and especially in Winnipeg's ability to drive play and also limit the amount of opportunities they're giving their opponents. A lot of teams aren't really getting too many crazy looks on Hellebuck, and I think that is a huge testament to this team's overall defensive structure. It's something that I think Bones first introduced in the past couple of years, and Arniel seems to be continuing at least a relatively similar trend. Where I sort of wonder, if things don't go well in the first couple of games for the Jets in round one of the playoffs, what will Arniel adjust? I think he's been very open-minded about some of the younger forwards. Cole Perfetti has become one of his most trusted players, especially late in games, which I think is a super smart change. That's something that I've praised before, and I think it continues to show that in many areas, I think Arniel has been more progressive and I think more open-minded and does seem to at least favor some things that are really beneficial to the team. But then I look at the top line and I have questions about the top line. So on the one hand, I think Arniel and Bonus definitely had a real hand in helping get KFC to have his best season ever. We saw signs of Connor starting to change his game at the end of last year, and this year it's really evolved into just being a top-line forward. He back-checks reasonably well, and it's kind of funny because I think years ago we said something like, if he did a back-check on maybe 30% of the rushes he faces, I think you'd be pretty happy with his performance. But he just didn't even do that before. So now you're at a level where he's playing really well. And I think that's a big reason why the top line has had such a turnaround, is because now they actually have their third line mate providing support and outlets the way that you're supposed to defensively. And it creates transition offense because you're getting the puck faster, you're getting back up the ice faster. It just leads to a lot more positive results. The thing, though, is that when that line starts to struggle at 5v5, you don't really see Arniel change it. If anything, the only thing that you really see is Iafallo going up there on that top line alongside Scheifele and Connor, and moving Velarde down, which to me is not really how you fix the line. I've not really seen him go back to Connor, Scheifele, and Ehlers at all, which I find very odd. Ehlers, when he's with Scheifele, I know that there are some reservations that Scheifele has about playing with somebody who's that difficult and unpredictable to sort of get on the same page with, but like Ehlers finds him for goals and points on routine opportunities. So I just feel like regardless of whatever we've heard about how difficult it is to play with him, that's not really showing in the results. They absolutely torch together, and so I don't fully, I don't know that I agree with how Scheifele has necessarily framed it. Not that he's really been like openly vocal about it, but I think we all know that that is a thing that has kind of been on the periphery of why Ehlers is not on the first line. And so if the first line starts to struggle, does that change? Would Scheifele be a little more open about it? Would they be welcome for shaking things up? It's not been a problem most of the year, but against those top teams, you've seen what I've kind of talked about with that line in the past. Again, not as bad as last year, but notably still not good enough for if you want to go really deep on a cup run. And again, it's partly dependent on what happens with some of their opponents too. A lot of these teams might be making big trade deadline moves, but we don't know that yet, and we don't know who's going to be doing what quite yet. So we just have to keep an eye on that, because that could really alter the Western playoff landscape. It could alter the Eastern Conference race as well, and that will eventually, whether early on or later in the playoffs, have a direct impact on what happens with the Jets. So that thing is one thing I'm keeping an eye on. I'm also curious to know, if a big acquisition comes in, what will Arniel do with the top nine, right? Because that is, there are certain lines that he will be willing to touch, and there are lines that he just doesn't. The third line, until there were injuries, he really didn't see Lowry get moved around all that much. And I kind of wonder, will he go back to Lowry and Ehlers together? I think that was a very tasty combination. I think that would be something that once Lowry's healthy again, you reunite. I know that Nemesnikov has been doing a very solid job there so far, especially since he's healed up. Maybe that was what was holding him back. But I think with how Lowry's game translates to playing with Perfetti and Ehlers, I would much rather go back to that. I think, Lowry has always kind of been your shadow to see. The points haven't necessarily been there in the past, and that's maybe the one thing that you kind of wonder about. But I don't know that I'm necessarily as concerned about it, so long as he continues to control the play, right? That's really all I worry about, just controlling the play. You continue to do that. You continue to create offensive zone pressure, and I think the points will just naturally come from it. Lowry also hasn't played with like loads of skill over the years. If you swap out Appleton for Ehlers, I think that is a huge change for your right wing position. And that's before talking about whoever the Jets might bring in a trade, right? Because they could bring in a center, they could bring in a winger. A winger would probably be cheaper. And with Lowry proving that he can capably keep up at that level, and quietly has been doing so for a while, it gives you more flexibility to rearrange your middle six, and gives you the potential to have 2 second lines. I think that's really what I've been sort of hinting at for a while now, is I want a first, 2 seconds, and a third/fourth. I think the Jets have the quality and capability of doing that. I think it would give them so much more flexibility with their deployments. And, Arniel has already shown that he's willing to relatively evenly distribute a lot of the depth units. You don't really see too many overplayed players. Even that applies to the blue line. Like, it's not like Stanley's playing 30 minutes a night. There are some scenarios where he has when somebody's gotten injured, and that part I do worry about. But otherwise, I think when it comes to the forwards, I feel like he's had a reasonable, pulse so far. Again, there are certain details that I kind of wonder about, like some of those line combinations and how much he would shake things up if things don't go well, especially against those top teams. But we just haven't seen enough to really push the Jets in a tough spot. And so I'm curious to know, what is the level of improvisation that we're likely to see? Because the league is not great this year, I do sort of wonder if that's going to be a bigger impact than maybe I'm expecting right now. But I don't have a great read on that yet. And until we get to the playoffs, I think it's going to be hard to see that. Maybe we'll see it post-trade deadline when teams have made their moves and we see a few of them and what they kind of match up like against the Jets. Colorado is weaker this year, and I feel like the Jets have a better chance in a 7-game series than they did last year. Still not 100% confident, but I feel a lot better about it than I did last year. Vegas is kind of up and down, but you sort of expect Vegas to do something big. So I always worry about them, but like outside of a couple of those types of teams, you don't see as many opponents that necessarily scare you. But that, again, that is pre-trade deadline. So in my mind, I want the Jets to really go out, get somebody big, and put this team over the top at a level that nobody else can match. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work, right? But I think the biggest thing the Jets can do is just show the team and the fan base that they are super serious about getting this team to the absolute best level it can be. I think the Jets are close, and I think there's a couple of tweaks could put this team over the top and even make the first line almost irrelevant in terms of whether they do well or not. But, that kind of remains to be seen how the front office will play this. We know that the Jets like to be bargain shoppers, and when they do, they've usually come away with pretty decent pieces. So let's hope that when they go back to the bargain bin this coming trade window, they find a real gem amidst all of the overpayments that you tend to see. But one trade partner that I'm a little worried about, I want to talk about the Philadelphia Flyers and why I kind of worry about what the Jets might be after from there in just a brief moment. Before we go too much further, though, just wanted to let you know about our friends and partners that I mentioned earlier at FanDuel. When the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started, and there's no better place to get in on it than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. With FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the game, so even if you miss the opening tip-off or want to bet on a big fourth-quarter comeback, you can stay in on the action. If you're looking for a bigger payout, you can even combine your live bets into a same-game parlay. I think this is especially great because you've got the Luka Doncic trade sort of in the rear view now. The Lakers might have a real chance at making a big run with LeBron again. This is a big LeBron legacy season, as if there already haven't been about 3 billion of them. But maybe you feel like somebody else is going to come away with the championship. Maybe you're watching the NBA Finals in a few months, and you're thinking, you know what, it's not the Lakers' year. Regardless, you can be sure to cash in on a cheap little $5 bet, because right now new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if that little $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com for your chance at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. Hey friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we're chatting a little bit about a trade partner that I'm not in love with. This is, a team that I think has been linked to the Jets a lot over the years. Nothing has ever really materialized out of it, and I'm thankful for that because at one point there was a really likely trade of Ristolainen for Ehlers, and I'm like, thank God that didn't happen. That would have been really depressing. But the Jets are, continually in conversation with this team apparently, and Rasmus Ristolainen keeps coming up, and I'm just like, I'm not like super upset about it. The thing with Ristolainen is that, his defensive value is pretty modest. And I think that there's a way to make him really do well, and it's probably pairing with Sandberg. That could be a really beefy, sizable unit. And in my mind, Ristolainen is like Dollar Tree Pareko, right? He's big. He skates reasonably well, but he's not the fastest. Defensively, he's improved a lot, but I wouldn't say it's like the biggest, and most impressive part of his game. Offensively, he's kind of there, not really generating a lot. So for me, I look at him as more of a third pairing guy. I don't really feel like he's a tremendous upgrade, and I kind of question how Arniel would look at it. I've had a lot of reservations about the whole Logan Stanley thing and what the Jets are planning to do with Stanley come playoff time. I'm sure the front office has a vision, but I don't know that that's necessarily Arniel's vision. So, I kind of feel like Ristolainen's not going to be like crazy expensive, but I also don't think that he'd really be worth the assets. And then you factor in Scott Laughton potentially being a player the Jets are interested in, and as a person in a locker room presence, Laughton is awesome. He's a great dude. I think he would easily fit in with the Jets. I just don't really want that, to be their big forward upgrade. Laughton is more of a bottom six center, really a fourth liner, and he doesn't bring enough offensively to really move the needle, at least from what we can tell, right? Lawton isn't exactly expensive in terms of his cap hit, but he's got another year of term. And because he's seen as like this gritty two-way forward, I think a lot of teams would be willing to pay a fair bit for that. And I'm just not that interested. The term is not really the problem so much as it, is the added cost of another year of him, which again, as your fourth line center, you're fine with, but like I just don't really see the value, right? I want them to shoot for like a big McCann type, a higher end forward who's bringing like 60 plus point pace per season kind of offense to this team, not somebody who just doesn't move the needle and slides into your third or your fourth line to be, a grinder. The Jets need more than that. They need somebody who can really drive play at 5v5, a big presence, and that's really what you need when you're spending considerable assets to make this stuff happen. If there is a guy from, the Flyers that I'd maybe have some interest in as like a rental more than anything, it's Kuzmenko. Kuzmenko only has like a game or two with them so far. And like you look at his history and it's very weird. Like he hasn't played a lot because he gets hurt a lot. And with Kuzmenko, I think he'd be a really good winger addition. He's lethal on the power play. He's got a great shot. His shooting percentage tends to be fairly inflated, and I think that's why, he got paid so much and really didn't pan out. But, with the Jets really needing to swing for the fences, I just don't think the fit here is Philadelphia, unless you're getting like a Sanheim. If you're getting a Sanheim, that is a very different story. But I'm just looking at, what the Jets need, what they're really after. And I look at this team and I think Winnipeg really needs to go for something big. Not Sean Couturier. I liked Couturier years ago, not now. While he would technically fill the roles and probably be an upgrade, his contract and cap hit are pretty scary these days. So if you can find a player of his caliber somewhere that actually is doing well recently, that'd be great. But, I think for what Winnipeg needs and what they're going to want, Philadelphia just doesn't feel like a great partner, but I kind of worry the Jets go there and work out some kind of a deal. And if it's like Ristolainen and Lawton at the trade deadline, that to me is a swing and a miss. I don't think those guys are going to be the needle movers that the Jets really need. And I could be wrong about it. Maybe they come to Winnipeg and become these stud players. I just don't see it. And I think the Jets really should be careful about what they're spending here, especially with all the options that are out there, Brock Nelson, Jared McCann, Brock Besser, players of that caliber. Even some of those guys have their own warts, but at least you're getting more proven commodities offensively and at a higher level than what you're seeing here. So curious to know your thoughts on this. Would you even want these guys? Is Ristolainen of interest? What do you think about a Kuzmenko? Who else would even be of interest to you? And that's actually realistic. They're not bringing in Konechny unless there's a huge surprise, so I wouldn't really worry about that too much. But hey, maybe the Jets talk about, a big Konechny trade. Maybe there's a huge mega superstar movement. I don't see it personally, but hey, Chevy did say that he was going to look at players who perhaps aren't available on the market. But for a lot of reasons, that's probably a deal you want to avoid. So let me know your thoughts on all of this. Drop them in the comments below or at my social medias at @LivingLoco and at @LO_Winnipeg Jets on Twitter. For tonight's episode, though, that's going to be all the time that we have. Thanks so much for listening. Have a great night. And as always, go Jets go.